Hey Robin, how you doing?
Hey George, I'm doing well. How about yourself? How you feeling?
I'm doing good. As always, it's a pleasure to have you on, and we can discuss a lot of things. Have the pleasure of giving some good knowledge to our listeners. So, what we got going on today?
So, George, you and I have known each other for a while now. You've heard us talk in clinical meetings and all kinds of meetings about many things. And there's been a lot of talk, not just recently, I think for quite some time, about body image and how this impacts the person's mental health in various kinds of ways. But recently, I came across something I had never heard of before. So, have you ever heard of orthorexia nervosa or just orthorexia?
No, I haven't ever heard of orthorexia. Do you have like any insight on what that is?
So, I came across the name and I thought, what is this now? Right? Like, I don't know. Not that I'm an expert in eating disorders, but certainly feel like I've heard all the diagnoses already related to it. So I had to look it up, did not know it on my own. So I'm going to actually read what I found on the National Eating Disorder Association website, which, by the way, I highly recommend to everybody listening for great information around eating disorders, the treatment of eating disorders. It really has a wealth of resources on there. So here's what they said. Although not formally recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which we call the DSM-5, awareness about orthorexia is on the rise. The term orthorexia was actually coined in 1998, and what it means is an obsession with proper, and these are not my air quotes, this is how it was written, or healthful eating. Although being aware of and concerned with the nutritional quality of food that we all eat is not in a problem in of itself, but people with orthorexia become so fixated and on so-called healthy eating that they actually end up damaging their own well-being. So since there is no formal diagnosis, meaning there, I guess, hasn't been enough research or maybe the powers that be that work on the DSM-5 have not come to a consensus, which is what usually it takes to get a diagnosis in that manual. So it's difficult to know how many people are affected by orthorexia. And this was the very interesting piece to me, whether it's a standalone eating disorder or a type of existing eating disorder like anorexia, which is the one I think we're very common with, or is it actually a form of obsessive compulsive disorder? So studies have shown that individuals with orthorexia also seem to have obsessive compulsive disorder.
So I just have a question, Robin. From your point of view, is the obsessive compulsive disorder because to me it's just hard to understand how can eating healthy and being conscious about healthy foods, how can that be a problem in someone's life?
So uh, I guess from the clinical point of view, like when I was reading this, the first thing I thought was, oh, I can kind of see how that happens, right? Because I can see starting with like the original idea of, oh, I should be eating healthy. We hear this all the time. We hear all the medical issues that are related to improper diet or poor eating. We know all the stories already about, eating sugar and all these things that can cause lots of physical and medical ailments, right? But I think if you are a person that maybe already has some symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, you take this idea of healthy eating to an absolute extreme. So instead of just saying something like, I'm going to try and eat organic food, no processed food, like things that we hear about all the time, I think that person will go beyond that. So they'll not only read labels, but they'll start deciding on their own without any maybe backup information, like, oh, this product has so and so ingredient, I better not have that. And I think as that starts to grow, like in their mind, right, this obsessional of being careful about what's going in, or like when I was reading about it, this word pure, like eating pure things, it starts to narrow what that person will actually be willing to eat. And by doing that, one, you're probably not taking in enough calories to keep you going at a healthy way. But two, you can cause malnutrition because who knows, right, what they're eliminating from their diet. If they're only eating, like, maybe end up eating like 5 or 10 food types or ingredients, they can maybe be missing out on proteins or healthy fats and, like fiber, like things that our bodies need just to maintain and sustain itself. So I think that's how it can lead to this really unhealthy practice and then make themselves sick in some kind of way.
Yeah, I could imagine how difficult, you know, dealing with this on a day-to-day basis could be because pretty much the only thing that I've never heard anything bad about is water. Like everything else, no matter, it could be vegetables, fruits, no matter what it is, there's always like pros and cons. You eat too much of this happens. So I could imagine it just being like a difficult day-to-day process and like overall exhausting having to check everything, be so detailed. Um, do you know like what causes orthorexia? Is there any particular underlying factor? Is this developed something earlier in life, later in life?
So that's a great question, because that's always what we ask, right? When we're working with anybody that's struggling with any type of mental health concern. So I had to again read because it's, at least to my knowledge, I've never worked with anybody that has had orthorexia or experiencing of it. So what I was able to find were some signs and symptoms of it, which is the first thing. But it doesn't seem to have like a precursor, like some kind of something about this person. I mean, maybe when there's more research done, it might end up seeing that, maybe a focus on body, a focus on what's healthy and what isn't, maybe while they were growing up, or maybe taught to restrict certain foods while they were growing up, like something, or some obsessional disorder that maybe initially was focused on something else and then kind of transferred itself when body image maybe became some kind of an issue for that person. But some of the warning signs and some of the symptoms that I found were these: compulsive checking of ingredients and nutrient labels, an increase in concern about the health of the actual ingredients, cutting out an increasing number of food groups like all sugar, all carbs, all dairy, all meat, an inability to eat anything but a narrow group of foods that are deemed healthy or pure, unusual interest in the health of what others are eating, spending hours per day thinking about what food might be served at upcoming events, showing high levels of distress when safe or healthy foods aren't available, and obsessive following of food and healthy lifestyle blogs like on Twitter or Instagram. And then, of course, body image may or may not be present, which was interesting for me to see because I think when I started reading about it, I immediately um, correlated the two, because that's how I think. But then I had to challenge my own thought because, again, I'm not an expert at all in eating disorders, and there are many people who are, and eating disorders of any kind need to be treated by somebody or program where they have that expertise. But in the early days of learning about anorexia, like kind of when it first started to come to light, um, the belief was that this was a control issue for that person, at least when it was related to anorexia. I'm not so sure that that is really true with like binge, people who binge and purge. But with anorexia, I think for people some of the ideology behind it, or the thoughts behind that practice, was it was the only way that that person restricting calories was where they felt like they had a sense of control over their lives, that whatever was going on, either in their environment or in their relationships, they felt they had no control, no say, but this was the one thing. But then it sort of, I guess, like diverged, and it became this body image related issue. Because one of the things, which is not always the case, but is body dysmorphia. So when a person looks in the mirror, and like you and I may look at them and think that they are a very healthy weight, and they'll look at themselves and they'll see them as, um, a, at a very high weight. And that's how, so they keep dieting or restricting down, and until, of course, very dangerously low weight numbers that can end up with them hospitalized, or even with death as the end result. So I don't know if there's anything in particular, but hopefully research will be done now that it seems to be a name. Orthorexia is getting out there. Hopefully more and more research will be done so we can know more.
And in regards to that, Robin, so I think that you said it was coined in 1998, so it's been about 25 years or so. Is that something that the governing bodies, the DSM writers, is that something that usually takes around this length of time when a new diagnosis or potential diagnosis pops out? Like, is there any like standard time frames when protocols are developed?
I don't know that answer for sure. I can just tell you from my experience, um, it takes a new DSM to come out, like a new edition. I don't know, like 15 years in between. So when I started my career, which was like 29 years ago, so there was a DSM 3. Now we're at the DSM 5 and then TR, meaning that they kept everything the same, but they added a few new diagnoses. And I never fully understood how a diagnosis gets presented to this panel of psychiatrists and doctors, because I believe that's who makes these decisions. But I almost feel like with the advent of social media and talking more and more about things, more TV, more everything than there used to be, I think when people start talking about it in society, like it just will come up, like, did you see so and so and how they looked? And I wonder what's going on with them, or somebody just talking about something that's happened to them. I think that could prompt a faster response, more research, and everything has to be done through research, and research takes time, and in order for research to be considered valid, it has to be done over a period of time. So I think everything has time attached to it.
And to me, now that we're discussing it, I have like a story that's like similar. I knew someone that was close to me. They were in a relationship with someone who was overly conscious of what they ate. I would say to the point that it started to affect their personal life a bit. They couldn't go out with friends certain times that they don't want to be around certain foods, or even get the temptation of eating off schedule. They kept a really tight schedule, and I know that that definitely strained their relationship. So, before it can get to that point, is there any way that someone can identify some of these symptoms within themselves, or if they do identify these symptoms, what are some steps you think they can take before maybe seeing a professional?
I'm not so sure that a, the person who it's impacting would probably notice it first. I feel like when it comes to that kind of thing, like where there's something behavioral going on, um, I think others around them that see them the most would probably be the first to notice something being off or changed in that person. In that example that you just gave, the person becoming like, oh, like maybe they used to like to go out to eat and never really thought much about it, but now all of a sudden is like, I can't. What do they have? I'm going to look up the menu first, which in of itself is fine, right? Like that's actually I belonged to Weight Watchers years ago, and that was like be prepared, right? Was like part of it, so that you can eat in a way that you feel comfortable. So on the surface, this all sounds good, but I think what happens is that when it starts to move into life disruption, right? That's what you're talking about. So it's like now they never want to go out, or it takes them hours of researching and planning just to go out to dinner in order to make it okay for them to go out to dinner. But at the end, the anxiety, I guess, right, like most obsessional things, it's anxiety that's triggering it, like whatever the thoughts are in their head is generating this sense of, like, this is scary, or this is fearful for me, or I can't control myself, or whatever the thoughts are, just becomes such a significant disruption that the people around them start to notice, like, wow, they're not eating anything, or they stop coming out. So I think a good friend or a supportive partner maybe would broach that subject with their friend or their significant other or their family member, um, and explain in a loving, caring way, not in a like accusatory kind of way, and that may be suggesting they see a medical doctor first, right? Like make sure there's nothing else going on, and then maybe that medical doctor can, if everything medically checks out, can then suggest, hey, you might want to talk to a therapist because you're entering into a danger zone. I feel like the problem with a lot of these, um, I hate to keep using the word obsessional because it almost sounds like an inappropriate word, but these behaviors, especially around eating and exercising too, by the way, um, I think if they're so in their own head that they can't recognize that something has gone wrong, like that they're like completely like have gone off like to one side, like there's no middle ground, right? It's like I have to do this, or then they fear all these things that could happen. Like if I eat that thing, like, oh, if I have that piece of candy and it has sugar in it, whatever their idea is, like this will happen to me or that'll happen. And I think it's very difficult for that person to really see what's going on with them when they're so in it, when they're so in their own head about it. So I feel like that often, like addiction to substances, it takes other people outside to help that person see what's going on, and like even if it's just by saying, hey, like this is what I see and I'm worried, really worried about you, or you're scaring me, you know I think that's really the best way to approach it and try and help that person get some treatment of some kind.
Yeah, and I could like I think I said it before. It must be really difficult, and you referenced it before also because this on the surface it sounds okay. Like someone who's conscious about what they eat, someone who's conscious about what times they eat, their exercise regimen, all that stuff. It sounds good on the surface, so it must be hard to internalize. If it ever does reach that tipping point where it is a problem. So yeah, and those might be difficult situations, right, to have with somebody. Like if I had to approach somebody, and I'm not the healthiest eater, right? I'm not someone who exercises often. And if I'm going to them and letting them know this stuff, their first thing might be like, man, you're the most unhealthiest person I know. Like, what are you talking about? They might perceive it as I'm trying to bring them down. Is there any ways like to maneuver around that difficult conversation?
I think you just have to have it, and I think we can get in our own heads as the person who is like the concerned person, right? Like, oh, they may think this, and oh, what if they react that? And that's our own, I think, anxiety thoughts about it, because it is an uncomfortable kind of conversation to have for many people, and you don't want this person to feel bad. You don't want this person who seems to be struggling to think that you're judging them, you know. So I think that's why it's important to come from a place of love. And you know what, George? If they say to you, like, let's say this really happened to you, and they said, like, hey, like, you're not the guy to be telling me this. And I think the answer is, well, you're right. Maybe I don't need to help you, but I care about you. And this is different for you. And I'm I'm seeing certain things, whatever it may be, that is worrying me, that maybe you're doing something that is ending up not so healthy, that maybe you started out thinking this was a really healthy thing, but some of what you're doing is concerning, and that's it. It's not that you're setting yourself up to be some expert, or like, hey, I'm the guy that like is the the shining example of good health or whatever. But I think it's just about letting that person know again that this is coming from a place of concern and caring for them.
Yeah, for myself, probably like what would trigger me to tell a friend is if I'm ever eating a really fatty, delicious dish, and they say something about my food. I'm like, you know what? We gotta have this convo right now. We're gonna do this right now.
That is funny, George. You're funny, and it is a touchy subject, right? Anyway, like weight, body, body image, body type, body acceptance, body positivity. And that's the other thing. And we've talked about it, and we've talked about maybe having a series of podcasts like around this issue, because the information that comes at us is huge, and it's fast, and it's from everywhere. It's like we hear people talking about unplugging from this, from that, from Instagram, from TikTok, but it doesn't matter, because if you read a magazine, or you read a book, or you watch a show on TV, I feel like everybody has ideas about how to be healthy. Everybody has ideas about what is acceptable in terms of body size, body shape, and I think that is can be beneficial, but I think ends up being a huge part of the problem. And then, we've talked on this podcast before about cultural impact, right? So, you can be from a culture where they think fuller sized bodies is a sign of health, because it means you have enough money to eat and be that. And then our culture, American, not our, but American is, especially for women, right? The thinner, the better. And all these things, right, have led to a lot of disordered thinking. It's hard to figure out what's, like you said it, right? There's a gazillion diets. There's a gazillion people who think, I mean, you can look up a book for everything, eating this way, eating that way. I've read a bunch of them for myself, like the all starch diet, the all potato diet, and I think it's really easy to get caught up and get lost in that. And I think if you're that person who already has concerns about yourself in some kind of way, and it's this negative loop going in your head, and it's kind of like it's like latching on to something, and then woof, it's like you're stuck on it, because it seems to have the answers to these negative thoughts in your head.
The loops, right? Those are the hardest things because you're just so in a bubble, so isolated that it's hard to even understand, how change can even come in your life.
It is, and it is also very hard, equally hard, to believe you can get out of it, and believe that you can break the habit. That's that cycle of that negative loop, or pessimistic loop, or a self-judging loop that's been going on in your head maybe for years. And it's hard to believe that you can think in a different kind of way, but it's also hard because it's that person has to do the work, right? It's like, so even if somebody comes to see me for therapy, I can help guide them, I can help them get answers, I can help them understand, I can educate them, but the work has to be done by them. And it's a challenge, right? Because you already don't believe that anything could be different. So it is a constant challenge where that person has to recognize that those thoughts are happening, and then challenge those thoughts and really work on challenging the behaviors that are attached to those thoughts.
Well, hopefully, with the great response we get from this podcast, the next DSM will have this diagnosis listed in there.
I hope so, and I don't want listeners to think like all doom and gloom. It is totally possible for any type of eating disorder or obsessive compulsive order to be treated. Talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy are still the most researched successful behavioral treatments. There's also for orthorexia in particular, it seems that exposure and response therapy, which has cognitive behavioral therapy components to it, has been very successful. So, and that's also ERP is what it's called for short. It's also successful for obsessive compulsive OCD disorders. So there's always hope, and there are always different methods. It's just getting that person to see and seek help, or have the people who love them in their lives help them seek help.
Robin, that's like a really powerful message, and I think that that's like a good way to put a cap on today's episode. It was very interesting getting all the insights that you have and like walking me through what uh, orthorexia is, some of the symptoms, the processes, and what you can do if you have a loved one or you yourself are dealing with this. So that was a great topic for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this new interest for me out of nowhere. I'm always interested when something new comes up, and I'm always thankful to have you to bounce things off of, and to also ask me very interesting questions that make me think too.
All right, guys, have a great one.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.